I know recently you've had some discussions and work around configuration settings in the Microsoft environment. Wondered what
Yes.
lessons you've learned in that context.
So there's a new tool that Microsoft just released to general availability called Azure configuration settings, which is a really pretty neat tool. If you're looking at, again, .NET Core, and really I think the newer versions of .NET Framework use this as well, but they have a new JSON-based configuration setting system, and it's based off of the iConfiguration contract that Microsoft has in there. And what that allows you to do is be able to use a lot of different configuration sources. So you can create a service in Azure using this Azure configuration service, and you can use it as the basis to store all of your configuration settings. And then you could potentially override those settings with local values from your application configuration.json file. And then you can do all kinds of fun transformations that you could do before with a app config or a web config, but it's so much easier now with the JSON files, where you're talking about something that might be used for development. So you got app settings.development.json, QA.production, that sort of thing. So you can do all these transformations. And so the thing that we found is that if you've got a relatively simple overall architecture where you really just have one application sitting by itself, that whole process can be relatively straightforward and simple. You've got some settings that are stored somewhere semi-permanently that's for a particular environment, and maybe one or two of those settings might be overridden for it in the local file. Maybe you don't override those settings. I think that's the challenge there, is that there's so many different ways of describing how the configuration settings work. And I know that myself and the other engineer that's been working on this particular project, we have spent a significant amount of time actually trying to make sure that we rewrite the documentation for our specific project in a way that makes sense to the engineers that are using it. The Microsoft documentation is fantastic, but it tries to cover all of the bases all of the time. So once we get in there and we look at our particular circumstances and you understand how the configuration settings work, where you can have a source, you can then add to that source. When you add to that source, the whole configuration setting comes together as an effective list, but it's additive, as well as as you move through the stack, you may override settings previously, and you can come from all different sources. You can write your own provider. There's so many different options that you really want to take your time and think about it, because if you're in a complex environment where you may have a corporation that dictates certain things and then a department that dictates other things, and then a group inside of that department that might be dealing with just some specific subset, and then your specific application, you could have a whole lot of layers going on in here that you could be sourcing from in order to get your configuration settings and overrides and additives. And then on top of that, you want to make them be in the code. You want to actually populate that against an object that you might build, a C# class, so that you can use it as compile time safety throughout your code as well. So there's a whole lot of things that you can do with this. I think the biggest takeaway is going to just be read the documentation, see what applies to you for Microsoft, and try to write up something short, or give some proof of concepts or demos to the different team members, because there can be a lot of different ways that this works, and it can get overwhelming quickly if you have a complex environment, and there are just so many different things that you can think of and say, well, what if this happens, or what if that happens, or what about this circumstance? And so you have to kind of get into, how much risk reward are you willing to take, and how complex of an environment do you have, and how are you going to manage that?
Thank you, Russ. That's a pretty deep dive into the Microsoft configuration settings, so appreciate that insight.
I could keep going for a while, unfortunately. Or fortunately, it's such a fantastic tool, but with great flexibility.